Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Yulia Pamphil, and I'm the Director of the Future of Land and Housing Program at New America. And today we are here to unveil the first publicly available data on DC eviction filings since 2020, and then to have a discussion with some of the leading voices in the DC eviction prevention space about what these mean and where we go from here. Before we start, I'd like to say a few words about why our team at New America took on this project. Over the last several years, our team has worked with housing leaders from around the country to help them track and analyze data on evictions in their communities. As many of you on this call know, this is typically civil court data that really should be available, but in most cases it's not. It's hidden deep within court systems and is really difficult to make sense of. So after helping dozens of municipalities access this data for themselves, we thought we should do this in our own backyard here in Washington, D.C. And D.C. is really no different. Eviction data is quite difficult to get a hold of here. And as you can imagine, this leads to some major challenges in trying to prevent evictions. If you don't know where evictions are happening, who is impacted, or even whether evictions are rising or falling, how are you supposed to pass data-driven policies and good eviction prevention programs? And so I'm just going to share my screen with some of our findings. Cool. So our team worked with January Advisors, which is a fantastic data science firm that's done leading work around the country to gather eviction data. And starting in June, we have been able to track daily eviction filings. In a moment, you'll hear from my colleague, Jeff Reichman, principal at January Advisors, who gathered and analyzed this data. And this analysis we'll present today gives a big picture snapshot over the last several years, and then goes deep into the 5-month period over which we have been tracking, June through October of 2025. And I'll say that while this data did reveal some really interesting insights, most importantly, it has showed us which questions to ask. Our findings elucidated some important points that are actionable today, but it also opened up major new lines of inquiry. So this work is really just beginning. And now that we have the data to do it, resources allowing, we will keep tracking these trends and trying to answer some deeper questions. So what this work has provided is a baseline as DC braces for the impacts of federal firings, immigration enforcement, and then entering into force of the DC Rental Act. As we know, 2025 has not been kind to the district as a result of RIFs and buyouts and then the cascading impacts of those job losses. DC had the highest unemployment rate in the country for 3 consecutive months over the summer. And then we rolled right into aggressive immigration enforcement, which has severely disrupted service industry jobs and put portions of entire neighborhoods on lockdown. And so we're seeing the economic impacts of these things roll in right as the DC Council has passed the Rental Act, which, among other things, makes it easier to evict tenants. And so with that context, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff to take us through some of the first findings. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Julia. So the eviction process, we think of it like a funnel, where eviction cases filed are near the top of that funnel. And this number is important because it helps us understand the number of households that are under imminent threat of eviction. If you have an eviction case filed against you, chances are in a couple of weeks, something's going to happen. So looking back before the pandemic, Washington, D.C. averaged around 30,000 eviction filings per year. But due to a variety of reasons that we'll get into later, including pandemic-era eviction policies, those numbers have dropped by almost 2/3. And now, since 2022, we've settled into a new normal. If we could go to the next slide, please. At the bottom end of that funnel, we're able to quantify the number of completed evictions, that is, the number of evictions that are carried out by government authorities, and this number is climbing. About 10 to 15% of evictions actually make it this far. We don't really know what happens to the other 85% of evictions, And it doesn't necessarily mean a positive outcome for the tenant. Some of these cases are settled, some are won, and in other cases, the tenant might just move out. So it's really important to note that we have these top of the funnel numbers of eviction cases filed and this bottom of the funnel numbers of completed evictions. But there's a big gray area in between where we don't really know what the outcomes are, and the data doesn't really tell us that. We can go to the next slide, please. So our study here went through a deep dive of daily filings in DC Superior Court of residential landlord-tenant cases from June to October of 2025. And DC publishes some really rich data. We work with eviction data across the country, and DC has some of the best data that's out there if you can get a hold of it. So if we go to the next slide, please. We're able to see the breakdown based on ward and neighborhood. And I'm going to take you through each of those slides just at a very high level, and then we can dig into it a little bit more in the Q&A if you're curious. When we break it down by political jurisdiction, basically the ward, we're seeing that wards 5, 7, and 8 are disproportionately large scale eviction filings. Ward 8 accounted for 28% of the filings, despite only comprising 16% of the renter population. And that's oftentimes the way in which we look at filings versus the overall renter population to understand proportion based on these districts. If we go to the next slide. Something that was really novel in this study that we were able to do is break it down by neighborhood. DC doesn't really have publishable neighborhood boundaries. They're usually combined together. And so we were able to use GIS software to break apart these neighborhoods and understand how is this affecting communities at a hyper-local level. And there were some surprises here. For one, that Southwest Waterfront and Columbia Heights were not mentioned before in previous studies of evictions, specifically in the 2020 Georgetown report that we used as a jumping off point for this study. And so what we're seeing is that there are, among other things, there are particular buildings in these neighborhoods that are particularly high evictors. And it's something worth digging into a little bit more. Overall, though, the top line narrative here is that evictions affect the city differently depending on where you live. There are hot spots, as you can see in the Southeast, and then there are particular hotspots, even in the Northwest, like Columbia Heights, where eviction activity is concentrated. And then there are other areas where we see virtually no evictions at all. I'll pass it back to you, Yulia.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. So drilling down even further, we were able to drill down on the individual buildings that had the highest overall numbers of evictions in this 5-month period. And I'll just note that in our report, there are interactive versions of all of these visualizations. You can actually hover over these dots and see the address of the building. And so this was really interesting to us because, as you can see, these are largely, but not exclusively, newer buildings in newly gentrified neighborhoods like Noma. These buildings generally have affordable housing set-asides, and we'll talk later a little bit about why we might be seeing high evictions in these buildings. It's also interesting because we found that the median rent paid by tenants facing eviction filings citywide was about $1,400. That was their median rent being paid, which is way lower than the city median of $2,600, and also lower than what you would expect from market rate units in these buildings. So zooming in even further for a second, this is the Westerly, which is the building with the largest number of evictions over this 5-month period. So as I mentioned, these are top line numbers, but even when you break them down into rates, many of these buildings are evicting at much higher rates than we see citywide. So the Westerly is a 450 unit building, which includes 136 affordable units. It's a luxury building on the Southwest waterfront, and it filed 61 evictions between June and October of this year. So if the Westerly continues filing at its current rate, it's going to end the year with a 33% eviction filing rate, which is nearly 5 times the city average. We also looked at the landlords with the largest numbers of filings over the 5-month period. And obviously, these top landlords, in part, this is driven by size. So companies like Bozzuto, William C. Smith, and Kettler have huge portfolios. But this information is incredibly useful because it means that engaging with just a few actors can have major impacts on DC evictions. So there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'll draw your attention to just a few points. First, we found that rental arrears are much higher than they were pre-pandemic. We think that this is a result of a few factors. First, rents have gone up, but also protections passed during the pandemic. For example, in 2022, there was a 30-day notice period passed where landlords have to give tenants 30 days notice before filing for eviction. That means that by the time an eviction is filed, a tenant is at least 2 months behind on rent. And second, while we did find some really eye-popping rent arrearages, some tenants were behind $40,000 or even $50,000 on rent. Those were extreme outliers. 3/4 of tenants owe less than $9,000 at the time of an eviction. And so I'd like to close by just giving a quick counterfactual to show why having this sort of data available is so important. As many of you know, the DC Council recently passed the Rental Act, which, among other things, rolls back some tenant protections, makes it easier to evict. And the Rental Act was passed in part on the back of robust data from landlords showing that tenants were delinquent on rent. And at the time the Rental Act was being debated, we knew that evictions had been high as of 2019. We knew several tenant protections had been passed in 2022, but at the time, so this is September, we didn't have public data on eviction filings since 2019. What we found out a couple of months later, after the Rental Act was passed, was that eviction filings have in fact plummeted nearly 60% since pre-pandemic. And tenant advocates say the 2022 reforms, several of which are now being trimmed back through the Rental Act, likely drove this historic drop. And so this begs the question, had policymakers known this information, how might it have influenced the contents of the Rental Act or even its passage? So I'll end just where I began by saying that this is really just the opening of our inquiry. These initial findings prompted so many questions, like what is happening to the 85% of cases that don't make it from filing to final eviction? Why are filings going down, but completed evictions are going up? Why are we seeing such hotspots in luxury buildings and so on? And so over the coming months, resources allowing, we're hoping to continue to track this data, continue to make it available, continue to engage with the DC eviction prevention community, several of whom you'll hear from in a second, to try to make these findings as actionable as possible to the broad range of DC actors who are working to prevent evictions and understand evictions across the city. And with that, I will pass things over to my colleague, Helen Bonnyman, a policy associate at New America, who will moderate our panel. Over to you, Helen.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll just allow, okay, great. All the panelists are here on stage with me. So first I'll ask you to introduce yourselves and then we'll jump into the Q&A. As Yulia mentioned, I'm Helen Bonnyman and I'm a policy associate on the Future of Land and Housing team at New America. I'll get to James.
Hi, my name is James Jarvis. I've been a reporter in the DC region for the last 6 years, mainly covering Northern Virginia, but more recently I co-reported an investigative piece with the 51st Street Sense and American University's investigative reporting workshop about the steady rise in completed evictions in the district, which ran in October, and I also teach graduate journalism courses at Georgetown.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Leah Hendy. I'm a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based here in DC. And we've had a long focus on supporting the DC area with data analysis, policy research, and technical assistance to confront inequities and create a region of shared prosperity. Over the last 4 years, I've co-facilitated the DC Eviction Prevention Co-Leaders Group, which is a cross-sector group that was formed during the pandemic and that produced a collaborative framework for preventing evictions for non-payment of rent.
Good morning. I'm Brian Rohall. I'm a housing attorney here at Legal Aid DC. Most of our practice is focused on eviction defense work. We work on many other tenant issues as well as a number of other issues for folks facing poverty in the city. I'm here, I think, to speak mainly to the experiences we're seeing in the courtroom and in cases that are coming through across our intakes.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to have all of you here lending your expertise to this discussion, so thank you. So Yulia teed us off really well with a great overview of the data as well as a little context. But Leah, I'm hoping that you could add on to that. And if you could provide a little background to orient the discussion today. In the last 5 to 10 years, what are some of the key changes in DC when it comes to eviction prevention and tenants' rights? And do you think any of these changes how they might explain the large drop in eviction filings that we've seen since before the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. As Yulia mentioned, there have been a few significant policy changes since the pre-pandemic era in DC, and I'll emphasize a couple. In the past, landlords could file evictions to recover small amounts of rent owed. Brian McCabe and Eva Rosen at Georgetown University found that 12% of cases in 2018 were for amounts of less than $600. And so landlords are really using the threat of eviction as a means of debt collection rather than intending to physically evict someone every time they filed an eviction case. The DC Council enacted that permanent legislation in 2022 to raise the amount of rental delinquency to above $600 before a landlord could file a case. That same law did make permanent requirements that tenants receive a 30-day notice that landlords intend to file an eviction before they can actually file. It also required landlords to submit photographic evidence that the tenants actually received the notice. And while this may mean tenants are further behind, it also gives some tenants opportunity to pay their rent that's due before they actually enter the legal process. And the court process has also changed a lot since the pandemic began. All sessions are now virtual. So this means that tenants are actually more likely to appear for cases than in the past, where they might have had to wait all day to have their case heard. And landlords were more likely to receive a default judgment in the past because the tenant had failed to appear for their hearing. But I want to kick it over to Brian if he's had observed other changes in his experience.
Yeah, I thought it might help to kind of give some examples of what Leah's saying, because hearing just like there are additional protections that have reduced filings. It might sound good or bad. It sounds almost like it could be taken almost as a barrier to the courthouse. But what we were seeing for a long time before those changes, the notice requirements, the $600 threshold, was, for example, on the 6th day of each month, large property holders, large landlords, and property management companies across the city would file mass numbers of eviction cases for folks who simply had maybe a day or two late paying the rent. And then those cases would be dismissed very quickly after the person had caught up in the rent before the initial hearing in the case. So that created a lot of noise and churn in those filings that now, with that threshold in place of $600, or a 30-day notice being required before the case can be filed, that resolves those cases before they even get to court, keeping that stain of a case off of the tenant's record. So that's an important difference, I think, in a protection that may not be transparent in that, but that barrier to filing is actually a barrier that probably is saving everyone the need to even be wasting the court's time with those filings. And then I'd also, well, I'll pass this then I think we let others speak, or if there's we can move on to the next issue, because maybe I should, Helen, I know where we're going to go. I want to raise this issue of eviction filings, as Jeff pointed out, are one thing, but completed evictions are, and proceeding to the end is a different. And I do want to emphasize that even if we're seeing filings dropping, we're also at a period where we're seeing actual completed cases leading to evictions increasing. Right here, remember, keep the word, we use the word eviction loosely. here we're talking not just the eviction filing being done, the case being initiated, but the true judgment entered and proceeding with the marshals coming to the door with the guns, right? This is an eviction proceeding. Those are increasing. And yet at this time that evictions are increasing is the time that the council has decided to make the process to proceed to obtain an eviction even easier. And that's, I think, the contrast that we really should be thinking about here is why that seems to be the moment that we're in, that we are now actually making it even easier, reducing the protections to tenants at a time when we're seeing those numbers increasing, of those orders being entered.
Yeah, thank you for noting that, Brian. And you did tee us up well for I did want to talk about how, we are talking about two different points in the eviction process. The analysis covers both eviction filings, which have dropped significantly since before the pandemic, and completed evictions, which, as you mentioned, are where the U.S. Marshals confirm that someone's vacated the home when ordered by a judge, and those are increasing. And so I now wanted to pass it to James, who has reported on this, and I wanted to ask, what have you found in your reporting that might explain this increase in completed evictions?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what Brian said and what Yulia and Jeff point out in their data that they shared, it makes sense that filing shot up back up after the moratorium ended, right? There's less restriction, more restrictions in place, right? But there's still kind of a higher bar, right? And those have been slowly rolled back. So it makes sense that there's overall increase. What's interesting is that filings have kind of plateaued a bit while completed evictions have kept rising. And there are a few big reasons for that. One, that attorneys and tenant attorneys and advocates kept bringing out to us is that the rollback of protections um, in place during COVID, including no longer requiring judges to stay cases when someone has a pending ERAP application. But another major factor is the gradual collapse of ERAP funding itself. ERAP, meaning the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which tenants apply for through DHS when they've fallen behind on rent, went from more than $60 million back in its peak in 2023 to just $8.6 million in this year's budget. And that's nowhere close to what's needed to cover the level of arrears that people are carrying right now. Arrears just meaning back rent. I believe the DC Fiscal Policy Institute published a piece several months ago before the budget was passed, estimating that we need around 200 million to meet the actual demand that's out there. And just to clarify, ERAP doesn't wipe out all the debt someone owes a landlord when they receive it, right? It only covers a portion of it. So you have a lot of people who were approved for ERAP over the years, and sometimes multiple times, who still owe thousands of dollars in back rent, right? And so it's not very surprising when a few weeks ago there was reporting about people lining up around the block of the DC Department of Human Services, hoping to get rental assistance, and the funding was gone within hours. And I don't know if Leah or Brian wants to piggyback on that point.
Yeah, sure. I think that the data shared has really highlighted in some of the points you mentioned, James, the big gaps we have in the city in terms of what people can afford to pay and what resources are out there to help them make ends meet. Tenants are also facing increased costs for a lot of other necessities, like groceries and childcare, that they're trying to make decisions about what they can pay for and afford. Last year, my colleagues and I did do a report that estimated the level of housing assistance DC would need to reduce unaffordable rental costs for households with very low incomes. And we estimated DC would need an increase of about $380 million for deep subsidies annually. That would be subsidies like vouchers or the local rent supplement program, beyond what we currently have available for those programs, plus another $153 million in shallower subsidies for households that have slightly higher income levels, between 30 and 50% of the area median. And even if we had all of those resources available, people still have emergencies. Their car might break down, or they have an unexpected hospital bill that really threatens their ability to make ends meet for that month. And we would need more than $76 million per year, assuming we had those deeper levels of subsidies for emergency rental assistance. I do want to point out, this isn't a problem that's unique to DC. The amount of rental assistance available and the availability of deeply affordable units doesn't meet the affordability needs of residents in most communities.
And maybe just to add on to this, on the discussion of emergency rent assistance, I mean, I think this might have been said implicitly, but I mean, there has been a significant cut. Not only is there a problem with accessing that assistance, but the amount of assistance available was cut dramatically this year. Which at the same time, the way in which someone accesses that assistance became, I think, a much less tenable. I can give an example of a person that I'm working with who, because of some things that went wrong with his medical insurance for a short period of time, had a couple $1,000s that he had to devote to his medicines necessary for his own life. That he fell behind in the rent. The insurance issue got cleaned up, but he then had this balance of a couple $1,000s. This is exactly what ERAP is for. However, he was unable to stand in line for an ERAP appointment, leaving him subject only to a short window of sitting on hold on a phone system that cut him off multiple times, and now he's unable to receive that rent assistance at all. And we don't know, will it be available? Is there any more that will be available at all? I mean, this is something where we're scaling back and changing the accessibility of that assistance, and where this goes as a case it's a very difficult story, and I think that those stories are all over the city.
Just to piggyback off of Brian's point, the other thing that kept coming up, especially for folks in the landlord world or people posting online, was this idea that like tenants are trying to game the system, right? And that's not what I saw in at least with the people I talked to and the attorneys who have clients in this space who are have received an eviction filing. I mean, a lot of these people are exhausted and embarrassed and they've waited long as they could before applying for rental assistance. It's kind of like a last ditch resort for a lot of these people, who've lost a job or on a fixed income or could no longer keep up with rising and or market rate rent, or had a medical issue or family emergency or something like that that knocked them off track. And to clarify, landlords, they do have a right to collect rent, and there is a problem with uncollected rent. And I think we were going to get into this, but I'll just mention it really quickly. We had reached out to the DC Housing Finance Agency, who shared with us that across 105 properties that they finance or monitor, tenants owed more than $21.5 million in back rent in 2024. So, that's all to say that, which is not insignificant. And so it makes sense that landlords have been, going to council saying, look, this is unsustainable. And the council has acted on that with a series of peaceful amendments and culminating in the Rental Act. But the story, isn't really that simple. Like tenants it's not just they're not paying. What we're seeing is that rents have climbed and wages haven't, and assistance has evaporated, and the legal timeline for completing an eviction is sped up. So that's all, really been a perfect storm that's really finally catching up with us. And and a lot of the reasons why we're seeing completed evictions increase, because people, who don't have a job and can't get rental assistance and can't afford rent, don't really have any other options.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It's pretty dire. Yeah. And so I did we've alluded to it several times, but just to ask more specifically about the Rental Act, which, as we've mentioned, was passed this fall. It'll speed up the eviction timeline in a variety of ways, including by shortening the notice period that landlords are required to give tenants before filing, and allowing eviction cases to proceed even when a tenant has an application pending for rental assistance. And so just to add on to kind of what we've already been saying, but I'll start with Brian. How do you think the Rental Act will change evictions and housing stability broadly in DC?
This gets into the weeds quickly. One of the issues with the way the Rental Act was passed is that I mean, the Rental Housing Act in the city, or the tenant protections in the city, kind of date back to the mid 70s and 80s, when a very complicated set of laws were passed that all kind of build on each other. And I think what's been happening is these changes have been coming through and rushed through the council in ways where there's not been much time to truly think through the implications of what these changes mean and how they could have downhill effects. And I can give an example of that in something that might seem a little arcane and technical, but it's worth, I think, understanding. In most non-payment of rent cases, the great majority of cases filed are for non-payment of rent. Tenants are required to generally can be asked to pay what's called a protective order. And these protective orders, this is not like a stay away order protection of like physical protection. This is protecting the landlord's accounting and pocketbook, right? This is the idea here is that the tenant is ordered to pay their rent to the court every month while the case proceeds, so that there is some funds available in the court. The tenant is not seen to be kind of getting over while the case goes on for some time, and they assert their protections and their rights. Generally, what has happened is that tenant is ordered to pay their monthly rent unless there's some reason that the rent may not be, that the conditions in the apartment are not up to housing code. And there's usually a time to allow the tenants to establish what the current conditions are before that protection order is entered. What the Rental Act has done is flip the time there and it ordered that at the initial hearing, the court must enter a protective order at whatever amount the rent the landlord establishes or claims is the monthly rent. And the tenant later will get some opportunity maybe to present that evidence of why it should be reduced, but the initial order will go in requiring the tenant to pay the full monthly rent. And the initial fear we have here are that there are at least two categories of tenants who could be quite hurt by this. By the way, failing to pay make those payments on time could lead the tenant to actually lose their right to defend their case and assert potentially meritorious defenses because they simply weren't able to make those orders. But I'll give you an example here of I'm working with a client who's in the complaint filed against her. They allege she had failed to pay $40,000 in rent. She lives at a project-based subsidized unit, meaning that the property receives funding from HUD and her rent is tied to her income, which is and so her rent's supposed to be 30% of her income. She has, without a doubt, not received income because she's on disability. She's received a very limited income. We know that there's no way the rent should have accumulated to $40,000. The property is claiming that her rent is $2,000 a month. She believes her rent should be at most $100 a month or so. And under the new rent, under the old law, the one it established for so long, she would have been allowed to have a hearing to establish what that rent was and what she should have been ordered to pay to the court. Under the law as written now, she will be ordered from day one to pay $2,000 a month to the court and as long as she makes those payments, she will later be able to present her defenses saying that the rent never should have been that high at all. But if she fails to make those payments, the court could strip her of her right to ever get the hearing in the first place. Similarly, someone dealing with terrible housing conditions could be forced to put up that upfront amount of money rather than using the money they may need to put themselves up in a hotel or somewhere else in order to live somewhere safe for them and their children. If they are not able to access that money because they're having to care for their families and put themselves up, they're ordered now to pay to the court. They fail to make those monthly protective order payments to the court. They could lose the right to ever get to that trial to establish that they don't in fact owe this money. So what we've done is create a system that procedurally is protecting the landlords, but seems to be giving an actual defense, or I would call it almost we're weaponizing what's supposed to be used as a protection, and it actually is making it an easier way for a landlord to proceed without having to actually defend or have any investigation of the claims that they're making that this rent is in fact owed. And so that, like I say, this is one example of how these protections can be quite difficult. Here, it just took me 3 minutes to explain that. This is not something that can be litigated in a quick, rushed way, or not litigated, I'm sorry, legislated in a quick, rushed way. The council really needs to take its time in making these changes because these changes have serious, effects. And what we seem to be having is this panic over things, which may not even have been a justified panic when we see the number of evictions that are actually rising. That we're making laws that are probably bad policy, certainly bad policy, but also probably not as well considered as they could have been with more robust debate.
Can I just jump in and add, I think the nuance that Brian brings up really elevates the need to have more data and evidence all along the court process, because I think a lot of decisions are getting made and we don't really have the information to understand those nitty-gritty details about how the policies are going to affect both tenants and landlords. And landlords do have serious rental arrears problems, as James pointed out. And if affordable housing developments go into foreclosure, we lose that affordability and we lose those subsidies. So that is a really important issue for us to continue to be tracking. But I do think we need more data and more evidence to figure out what's really happening and understand what's working and what isn't working.
And just to add really quick to Leah's point and to what Brian was saying, I think it's really important to hear anecdotes from people who are actually, in these situations, because it's one thing to look at the data and look at the numbers, but it's another thing to understand the nuance of these situations. Like, I'd spoken to a woman who was in a domestic abuse shelter, right? And was finally gotten a job. It was part-time during COVID. I think that she would work in the Department of Health, um, doing COVID vaccination tracking or testing tracking, something like that. Was only making maybe $25,000 a year or something like that, and was also part of the rapid rehousing program. So they put her in a market rate house, over in Noma neighborhood, paying $1,800 a month. And that rapid rehousing program only lasts 9, 12 months. And you can only get, I think you're only eligible for extension, if you're if you're part of a family or something like that, or have kids. But she wasn't eligible. And so she then had to pay that full sum of $1,800 a month, even though she was, not making nearly enough to cover that. And so then she started, no surprise, to fall behind on rent. And and then that just got her off track, and she's been in court for years now trying to figure that out. And she was finally able to get a full-time job, but even still, I mean, that's only paying between $50,000 and $60,000 a year, which again is not enough to really cover that and all her other expenses. So, you know, sometimes it's just that, people fall into these situations, and have a really hard time getting out of them. There's not a lot of, support available to help them get out of it. But also at the same time, there's also some of these programs that keep them in this cycle that make it really difficult for them to get out of it, and keep them in it as well.
Thank you all. Yeah, the Rental Act has a lot of different factors in it. And so I appreciate, Brian, especially you took it really specific, but I think that's really important to talk about because the the wide-ranging effects could appear in a lot of different areas of the eviction process. And so with that act anticipated to go into effect probably early next year, we are anticipating that our future tracking of these numbers might start to show those effects, but we'll have to see. So now I wanted to also go in a pretty specific direction, but just calling back to something that Yulia alluded to about something we were surprised about with these numbers, which is that we saw really high filing numbers in luxury buildings specifically. And I was curious what you all, but especially Brian, but anyone, why do you think that we're seeing those high numbers of filings in luxury buildings?
I don't know if anyone might be surprised that the question about the luxury buildings goes to the legal aid lawyer, but this is something this is a pattern we've been seeing even before New America's numbers came out, but it simply confirms something we've been seeing just across our intakes, which is that we're seeing, especially at a lot of these luxury buildings, which are these newer construction, higher rent buildings. So a new practice seems to have been adopted in more widespread ways related to kind of there's a rent is charged in a lease. There are generally tenants take on responsibility to maybe pay the Pepco bill and certain utilities, but then there are a number of other charges that are then also set out in the lease: amenities fees, common area utilities charges, technology access fees, and these fees are not optional. that the tenant can opt out of them. They are essentially what used to be considered as rent, but now are being redefined as some other category. And where that starts to affect our clients, and what I think is driving these evictions is at these luxury buildings is not the eviction of somebody who's just well, let me explain. We have a lot of clients who have housing choice vouchers or other local rent locally subsidized vouchers. And these are vouchers allow a tenant to pay a percentage of their rent, or percentage of their rent is calculated based on a percentage of their income. They take that voucher to any private building, and many of these luxury buildings have taken those, and we've encouraged them. Their source of income discrimination is not legal in the city. We want these large luxury buildings to be taking people of all different incomes into their as tenants, and that's very good. But what's happened is those vouchers pay the tenants rent. They give the tenant an allowance for utilities, which are very narrowly defined as usage for electric, gas, or in particular utilities rated average for that unit, but do not in any way account for this third category of other, sometimes we can call them junk fees, but these common area utilities and everything else. So now imagine a tenant who has zero income, so they would pay zero rent. They get a utility allowance to pay the Pepco bill or the water bill or whatever they've got. But these other charges, which sometimes can range $200 to $300 a month, are sitting out there, and this tenant is unable to pay any of that because they, again, remember the voucher, they have zero income. That's supposed to be supporting their housing. But what's happening is those tenants are seeing, at these luxury buildings in particular, we're seeing a high number of suits, not for non-payment of rent, but for non-payment of utilities. And those cases, the law is very different for non-payment of utilities than it is for non-payment of rent. If you fail to pay your utility bill, you don't have a right to come up and catch up on that rent necessarily. The landlord sometimes allows that, but sometimes proceeds to put this person out. The assistance available to these folks is different because there's ERAP, emergency rent assistance, doesn't cover utilities. And our utility assistance programs are usually only available to folks to pay utilities that are in the tenant's name. Common area utilities are not in the tenant's name. So this is a gap where there's no assistance available. These tenants are being set up to fail in these buildings and being churned through, we think, in a good number of evictions. And again, to think about why this focus is on these voucher holders and subsidized tenants, I think that if somebody on a market rate rent without a voucher at all is not paying their utilities, they're probably also not paying their rent. Those cases would come through straightforward as a non-payment of rent case. But what we're seeing is increased suits against folks in these buildings in particular for not paying their utilities. And I think the impact of that is really falling almost exclusively on these voucher holders. And that's really what we're concerned about here is that it's a combination of how the voucher program is administered, but also how this practice in redefining what rent is to be these other things has led to a lot of downhill, just other problems as well. I could go on about that, but I think that is really driving a lot of these luxury. We're honestly, when we see a utilities case come through, I almost can guarantee you it's going to be sitting in Waterfront or Noma, and that matches the numbers that New America has put together here, and January Advisors.
And just to add to that too, um, yeah, many low income tenants like aren't just paying right to Brian's point, they're not just paying market rent, they're relying on DCHA vouchers, rapid rehousing, HUD subsidized units, and other programs where your housing depends on you recertifying your income and submitting paperwork on a pretty strict schedule. And so that what we kept hearing as well from um what I kept hearing from attorneys who are working with their clients to try to get this paperwork filled out is that you know from the landlords and property managers, like on their end, it sounds like it's kind of a mess sometimes in these larger, uh, multifamily unit buildings. And there's been a lot of issues with things like turnover. There's been a lot of slow and inconsistent reimbursement from these agencies because the paperwork is getting lost, so there's no clear point of contact at DCHA, and like inspections are taking so long that units sit vacant. And so um, that's another reason why money sometimes isn't being collected because there's a lot of people that are eligible for these things that these programs aren't um, getting that paper. So it's getting lost somewhere in that process. And so you know, they're getting these notices that they're failing to recertify, or that they're suddenly responsible for the full rent. And that's not because they weren't trying to submit their paperwork, but because their documents sat in a queue for weeks, or the property manager uploaded something incorrectly, or DCHA never processed the file. And so, once you're coded as kind of non-compliant, it becomes incredibly hard to unwind that, even if it's not necessarily your fault. So there's a lot of instances in which, um, and that's hard to see in the data, that nuance there. So, maybe they're also, I don't know what the percentage is, but that was a common, um, anecdote that I heard as well, is that, uh, a lot of reasons why these landlords aren't able to collect rent sometimes is because they rely on these programs that aren't then, um, coming through for them, either because it's an administrative failure, or, you know, a personnel failure. Um, and sometimes that just makes it really difficult to collect rent if, that paperwork doesn't get submitted.
Thank you both. I think seeing the data, seeing the charts is really important, but equally important is getting to hear these stories and understand this, add a little color to what the data is telling us, and that can really paint a picture of the immense challenges that particularly low-income renters in the district are facing. So thank you. Now I'll take us to our final question in sort of a lightning round format. I would love for you to each share what you'd like to know more about in future analyses. As Yuli mentioned, we're hoping to continue tracking these trends, taking in all of the expertise that you all have lent so that we can continue to paint a better picture. I also wanted to ask the audience to please weigh in the chat. I'd love for you to answer this question as well. What would you like to know more about regarding evictions in DC in future analyses? So I'll just pass it around for in a minute or less. And let's start with Leah.
Sure. Well, I'm a data person, so I'd love to have more data. I think particularly the court has done a lot to try to improve some of the timelines. I think understanding the different parts of the eviction process and how long they're taking, and how long some of these policy changes, how they will impact those timelines, will be really important to see if we need to tweak things going forward.
Brian?
There's many different things I could suggest here. One, though, is that I think that we're seeing when we see those numbers of rents that are so high, or whatever, the higher initial balance. I am very curious. There have been there's about 100 properties in the city that are subsidized, not through vouchers, but it's kind of what's called site-based Section 8 or project-based Section 8. Sometimes this is kind of like a privatized public housing, that, like I say, about 13,000 units in the city. But these are some of the ones, like the one I talked about, the woman with the $40,000 balance that in fact probably should know anything. I think that a lot of those balances at some of those properties are quite high. One of the frequent filers that's listed, that's called out in New America's report, is one of those properties that filed, I think, about 70 cases in the period they studied. But I think that the balance there makes it's very absurd to me to think that if 100% of the properties there are supposed to be tied to someone's income, that an average balance at that property is somewhere around $10,000. Something is going wrong in that property. So seeing those broken out and kind of looking at, are these particular subsidized properties not an issue of tenants not paying their rent, because we always want to blame the tenants for not doing their rent, but in fact might be an issue of management not processing paperwork correctly, or a different way in which those subsidies are administered, not to blame the management, but just the process. And I think honestly, the way we do finances in the city and calculate income has changed so much, that some of that has made those numbers artificially inflated and caused us to respond to data in maybe inappropriate or rushed ways. And I'd like to see that more nuanced sort of breakout. Would be something I think that could be more could be fascinating.
Yeah, one thing I'd love to see in future analysis is more clarity around what happens before the case becomes a completed eviction or gets to that point. I mean, we know how many filings there are and how many people end up getting removed by the marshals. Um, but the middle is, what happens in there is kind of a black box. So one of the things we were really curious about when we were looking at the data is like, what percentage of these cases are dismissed, like how many people are moving out early. Are people doing it like voluntarily? Because that's another thing as well is, we don't know how many people are self-evicting. And I'd be curious to know, what percentage of people, who receive an eviction notice are just self-evicting and leaving, instead of going through that whole process, versus how many people are getting their case dismissed or received, you know, um, some kind of bailout because of ERAP, or they got their job back and they were able to pay the back rent or something like that. But we don't actually have a lot of, at least I didn't have a lot of information or access to that information, um, about what that looks like. So more data around that, more transparency around that would be, I think, really helpful as well to give some more context.
Absolutely. I agree. I think more data access and just better understanding of the problem will only help all of us and all decision makers in the district make decisions that can improve housing stability here. All right. Well, now I'm going to move us into, for our final few minutes, some questions from the audience. And so first, I'd like to share a question from Nancy. Brian, could you talk about how legal help makes a difference in cases where tenants receive it? Data shows that a high percentage of those cases are resolved without eviction.
I think that's a great point, and that's something that we really, although I think I've come down hard on the council for some of its recent actions here on the Rental Act. I think one thing that we really should recognize is that even before the pandemic, the council was really ramping up the funding for civil right to counsel. We don't have a universal civil right to counsel, but we have significantly increased resources in the city, allowing tenants to access uh, both representation and, if not representation, at least advice on a regular basis. We now have a phone network that allows folks to connect, at the, not just on the day of court, but before court very easily with lawyers, to potentially get connected with legal services. And I think that we're seeing the number of people who are represented and I want to say happier outcomes. There's no happy outcome. I mean, no one's happy to be sued, but I think we're seeing less awful outcomes in those cases that and this is to James's point about what's happening in those cases that are not resulting in eviction. I think that we're seeing a good number of cases where tenants are coming in and with counsel navigating this process a lot better than they did, certainly back before that funding was available in 2018. And that's something that I think would be something. The Bar Foundation has been doing a lot of great work with some research companies to put out its own reports about that the results of this right to counsel. But I think those results have been quite positive, and it's very promising to hopefully that continues.
That's great. That is really promising. The next question is also for you, Brian. And it was someone wanting to verify, did they hear correctly that the Rental Act requires judges to issue the protective order at the initial hearing?
I believe that the rental, I need to be careful not to give legal advice here in the middle of a call without a law in front of me, but I believe that the language in the Rental Act says that the court shall enter a protective order upon request at the amount the landlord has stated that the rent should be, or something along those lines. So it is mandatory in nature that it now seems to require that. And then there is an opportunity for the tenant to request a hearing to put on later evidence about why that amount might be reduced based on housing conditions if they want to challenge that. But there's also some strange language that says that the judge at the same time must warn the tenant of the consequences of falsely asserting a legal defense. And we're very concerned that a tenant, we haven't seen how this is administered yet, but of course there's some concerns about what does a threat from a judge about be careful you don't do something if you don't know what that legal defense even is yet, because this is being done at the initial hearing, which is most frequently the time that a person has not yet been able to connect with the lawyer and find out what their rights are. So it is shifted from the courts having discretion to do it. There is some mandatory language now, which is to enter what they're calling a preliminary protective order at those first hearings.
Great, thank you. All right, and then next I'm seeing a couple questions just kind of asking to think a little big, think in a hopefully optimistic direction. thinking about our future in the district. What is one thing, whether related to any upcoming elections or just, more general or hypothetical, what's something that you would like to see from uh, from DC policymakers to protect renters from evictions and promote housing stability?
More rental assistance. I think we can't have enough. As I mentioned, some of those really large numbers, we need more funding for deep subsidies. So those are for the very most low-income people in the city. We need shallower subsidies too. Maybe they don't need to have they're only paid 30% of their income towards rent. Maybe they have a little bit more ability to pay, but they're still struggling to meet ends meet every month. We need subsidies for that. And then finally, we need more emergency rental assistance to help people when they face those, just like the insurance issue that Brian mentioned. When you have those kinds of emergencies, we need to have resources that are available more than one day a year for folks to access.
I'll jump in here too and offer my 2 cents. I think that, DC has a mandatory notice period before a landlord files for eviction, and the Rental Act does trim back that notice period to either 10 or 15 days. I can't recall, but it still exists. And what I would love to see is a concerted effort to catch tenants and provide them with assistance in that 10 or 15-day period. Requiring notice means that there is a way for legal aid, for rental assistance providers, for others to find out that a tenant is at imminent risk of filing. And that really is the time to be able to intervene. And so, we've seen other jurisdictions get creative about how to offer services in that crucial time window before the tenant gets that like scarlet E on their record, right? Because even if a filing is eventually dismissed, they still have the filing. So that is one thing that we would really encourage.
And just to piggyback on that point, when we were doing research and court observations in Michigan shortly after the pandemic, and when ERAP was being distributed, I think a best practice that they had was they had a social worker in every courtroom. And that social worker essentially could interrupt the proceedings and do a sidebar with the tenant to make sure that they were enrolled in ERAP. And they ultimately led to a lot more settlements. It doesn't prevent the eviction case from being filed, but it certainly leads to either a better outcome immediately, or it delays the inevitable. And I think that that's something that if we're talking about throwing bodies at a problem, that's a very good way of doing it.
Just one quick point on that, Jeff. We did have housing counselors in the courtroom for a long time, and I don't think there's enough funding right now to continue to support them to be in the courtroom.
Totally understand. And from my point of view, I think that funding an ERAP program in and of itself is extremely expensive, but funding court navigators, additional legal counsel, or social workers to help people come to a soft landing is a fraction of that cost.
And I would just add here too, there was a lot of, over the, leading up to the Rental Act, there was a lot of discussion about, how much is this costing landlords, which is an important point to bring up. But it was a very heavy focus on that. And I'm not a staff member or a council member, talking to their constituents on a daily basis, but it was really enlightening for me to talk to people who are really going through this experience in real time and talking about the nuance of their situations and what they're experiencing, and how dire their circumstances were. And so, you know, does there need to be accountability in terms of people paying their rent? Absolutely. But it's also incumbent on our elected officials to also, weigh, um, you know, what that does, in the longer term, if people, have no support, and can't get housing, just period, as a result. So
since since I want to make sure I get a chance to answer that question, I think in addition to all of those things that have been said, I do think that we should be considering, small scale issues related to those utility issues. That's on both accountability of DC Housing, reforming some of its policies, and maybe the council has some legislation in front of it now, which I think it could be the door to at least to making some of these changes, maybe not as it is now, but with some revisions could be improved and solve some of those problems. But I also think, just to the bigger picture, why we are at a time with rising evictions, at a time with economic uncertainty for the community in DC, at a time when we have immigration police pulling people off the streets and families scared to go outside, let alone to go to work, that we are now making it easier to proceed to the eviction process rather than putting our resources toward protecting those tenants, which is what the city has historically done. The Rental Housing Act has always been one of the points of pride when we speak about housing advocacy around the country. DC is one of the points we point to and say, now we're doing it. And now what's happened is many of those protections are getting rolled back in this what seems to have been this panic, and the story seems to have shifted to the focus not on the tenant but on the property owners. And I think we need to shift that back to what is really happening here. Number of evictions rising. This is not the time to make it easier to get even more of those go forward.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great note to end on, and I apologize, we're a couple minutes over, but thank you all to those who are still with us, and thanks so much to our panelists and our collaborator, Jeff at January Advisors. Thanks for this really important discussion today, and looking forward to continuing the discussion in future work together. Have a good day, everyone.